morning and welcome to the lecture Gender, Environment, and Housing Resilience, featuring challenges of equity and sustainability. This lecture is the fourth session of the SICAR PH and NRC lecture series in 2021. This event is co-organized by the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines Investing in Climate and Disaster Resilience Project of the Ateneo de Manila University and the National Resilience Council in partnership with the John J. Carroll Institute on Church and Social Issues and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of the Ateneo de Manila University. Our session today is broadcasted live on Facebook pages of Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines and the National Resilience Council as seen in your screens. So please be guided by today's house rules. All attendees and participants are automatically muted upon entry. So please turn off your videos and microphones, especially if you're not called to speak. The ceremony will be recorded for our documentation purposes. For our panelists, the microphones and videos, again, must only be used when necessary. For our attendees via Zoom, you may send in your questions through the chat option found at the bottom of your device and your screens. For our attendees on Facebook, you may send in your questions through the comment section. Our team will be noting this and hoping to raise it during the open forum. We begin this webinar with opening remarks from our webinar conveners, starting with Ms. Maria Antonia Yulo Loyzaga, President of the National Resilience Council. Ms. Loyzaga is also the co-principal investigator of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines project and the trustee of the Manila Observatory. So I now hand over the floor to Ms. Tony Loyzaga.
Good morning, Ina, and thank you very much for that introduction. Good morning to everyone. I'd like to greet, of course, Dr. Emma Porio, our very, very able and energetic partner in all this work. Our keynote lecturers, Professor Mariano Ocampo from MIT, Dr. Jane Karaos from the John Carroll Institute, and our reactors, Honorable Kiko Benitez, Attorney Junefe Payot, Ms. Jessica Soho of WeEffect, and of course, Ms. Mayan Ignacio, also a new partner of NRC. I'd like just to say a few words on our thoughts at NRC on the topic, gender, environment, and housing resilience, and challenges of equity and sustainability. Very briefly, because this is just an introduction, what you see there is an image of an area called Little Samar, which is just outside of Navota. And this area has now been practically demolished. They have put up a new seawall, basically, I guess, to stop the water from entering the Navotas area. But I wanted to highlight this because it represents resilience in design. And at the end of the day, what happens here during a storm or a particularly violent current, for example, is these structures actually are quite flexible. They're built on bamboo, they're built on stilts. The heights, as you can see, are adjusted to the environment. And you can see that livelihoods are featured very prominently in the way that the bangkas or the small boats have their own berthing space. This is a clear understanding of the environment and the needs of this particular sector who are not accommodated in housing in the city. Next slide, please. So just a very quick review of the way we view resilience at the National Resilience Council and how we work with our partners. There are these pillars, as we call them, on human development, local economy, infrastructure, and that's the built environment, the environment itself, ecosystems, and the way resources are being used, and human security, and that's public safety, personal safety, as well as, of course, the access to food, water, and energy for a certain level of quality of life. Leadership and governance are critical in terms of attaining the outcomes that we would like to attain. And the impacts, of course, at the end of the day, we would like to see reduced deaths, reduced damage to households and agriculture and infrastructure and livelihoods, and of course, some level of development continuity. And this is where we think we are well placed with all the group of reactors today and speakers today in terms of the type of built environment we all need in order to ensure resilience, not just to current risk, but to future risk posed by climate change and other types of hazards, including the biological ones, such as COVID. Next, please. At the end of the day, we look at the intersection between these SDGs in particular and the targets of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. These targets are measurable, and that's why they're there. At the end of the day, we also look at qualitative measurements, issues as to conditions, physical, emotional, social, that are actually not measurable by any kind of unit that we can actually determine. But these targets are useful. We are set to actually, in fact, advance them and actually achieve them. And this is where the work of the NRC is actually located, in the intersection between the SDGs, the Sendai Framework, and of course, the Climate Change Agreement and the New Urban Agenda as well. Next slide, please. Today's topic and the consistent topic over this last month with the coastal cities at risk has been the issue of gender and particularly women and disaster impacts. This is from a new study, fairly new, published by the World Bank on the link between gender and human and vulnerability and impacts. So this is a cycle of vulnerability that we see wherein inequality due to gender actually results in vulnerability, and therefore the impacts are actually felt in a different way and in a deeper way by people of gender that are considered, for example, women and young children and other types of gender identities are included here. Impacts, in fact, deepen that vulnerability. And so the cycle continues. Next slide, please. So today's topic, and I just wanted to raise this before all the talks begin, are topics that we see as topics that deal with opportunity and vulnerability of space and place in the city. What you see here are two sites, one in Sipak Almacen and one in Payatas. And we are looking at the way people live, where they live, and how they live, particularly the conditions that impact women, and look at the environment at which they actually must sustain their livelihoods and their lives. Next slide, please. Typically, we see these types of settlements wherein we must all situate ourselves by the sea and by esteros. Next slide, please. On floodways, such as the Mangahan floodway, and on landfills. And what we call gillages, the gilid ng village, or the side of the village, next to residential, commercial, and industrial developments. Next slide, please. At the end of the day, the question must be asked, how is a gender-inclusive city defined in light of climate change, multiple hazards, including the biological? This is a recent publication by the World Bank as well, looking at access, mobility, safety, and freedom from violence, health and hygiene, climate resilience, and security of tenure. If we're able to address these in some small measure by design, by situating our different types of housing products, then we would be able to say perhaps that we are moving towards a gender inclusive city that is resilient. I just wanted to close by pointing out that there is a monograph that was published many, many years ago on the redesign of Tondo and Dagat-Dagatan area. That monograph actually contained several opportunities for in situ upgrade and the quality of life resulting from that upgrade in terms of engineering and architecture. And I think that that monograph needs to be revisited because it did not advocate relocation. It advocated in situ upgrades. And those are opportunities for social, economic, and cultural resilience that we can actually preserve if we only consider how we might be resilient by design in the city. Thank you very much for this, for inviting us to be part of this event today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Louie. Up next is the co-convener of this lecture series, Dr. Emma Porio. Dr. Porio is the project leader and the principal investigator of the Coastal City Settlers in the Philippines project and the professor of sociology in Ateneo de Manila University. She is also a science research fellow at the Manila Observatory. So let us now welcome Dr. Emma Porio.
Morning, on behalf of Father Roberto Yap, the President of Atty and project holder of Coastal Cities at Risk. Let me welcome you to today's webinar. This is our fourth webinar of the Coastal Cities at Risk National Resilience Council lecture series for 2021, but this is the third gender-focused webinar. I basically made this decision in honor of Women's Month and also really to put gender as a major interrogating frame in looking at climate and disaster resilience. Also because, as I will say later, about the challenges of equity and sustainability in the city. So um, what I would like to do, I'd like to also to thank the intellectual and material generosity of our speakers. Jing Karaos and I have been working since 1990s, starting with the Global Urban Research Initiative. And then we also are very grateful to Mary Ann Ocampo, who's very busy in Massachusetts, but really consented to my pleading that please, you're the planner and architect. We need you here in really looking at gender, environment, and resilience in Metro Manila. So, Mary Ann, thank you very much. Jing, and then of course, me and Ignacio. We've been together for so many years, but lost for a while the last few years. But I'm so happy to be reunited with her. And then, of course, to Jessica Soto, I'm working now with gender equality in housing, and then to Attorney Junefe Payot, who's been, very supportive of us, and of course to Congressman Kiko Benitez and Gallo, thank you very much for all your intellectual and material generosity. I always say to people in the CCAR-PH, the scientists, I always say to innovate is to collaborate. But to innovate is also to navigate the systems that we are working. So it's really, I believe that by being together, we can be more. And by working together, by collaborating and being always trusting the other, that we are looking towards the same future, creating a better future, that I think we're able to do this. So thank you very much. So I would say basically that um, Asian cities for the last few years has been the most dynamic and the most prosperous in the region. But it also houses 60% of the 1.2 billion slum population. So just like in Metro Manila, we have we're the most prosperous. We account for 37% of the GDP, but also we have the most number of housing backlog, the most number of urban poor population that are supporting really the city with their services and their cheap labor and the like. So we would like to say that um, the work that we're doing in Sikar is really looking at how the city, we are basically visited typhoons a year, and also so there's flooding, and the floods we up again, we repeat the same thing problems that we have. For the last 50 years, we've always been relocating people outside, and then they come back because they don't have livelihoods there, they don't have water, don't have other basic services there. So by holding this seminar, I hope we're able to connect, the growth of the city, expansion of the city, as well as the increasing vulnerability Ondoy, Marikina in 2009 on the left side of the picture, and you have Ulysses on the right, last November. Then you have Yolanda, You can see the women, children, and elderly there amidst the rubbles. Then you can see here in Ulysses, this is upstream in Rodriguez Rizal. You can see here the children and the women and, looking on the rubbles of the aftermath of that typhoon. And then downstream, they're being evacuated. Again, still the same kind of images that you'd see. And then we also have COVID-19. I remember when we had Ambo in June, it displaced so many people, but we also have the evacuation and the like. And I also remember that before Ambo, there was a big major fire in Sampaloc, and then later another fire and the like. So you will see and that what we have really is that we have the hazard flooding, the typhoons, and then we have the COVID. And so I will show you here in this climate disasters, women really suffer more. We did this in Ondoy, and we did this again in January for the Ulysses. And you can see that in pre-Ondoy, Ondoy period, and up after Ondoy, women-headed households always spend suffer losses 20-30% or higher. In terms of the absences of school of their children, the number of work days lost, the number of the average income that they lost due to floods, the amount of medicines that they have to buy, and all these other kinds of things. So here you can also see I summarized the number of COVID infections and deaths and displacements due to climate events, and really resulting into what I call cascading disasters. So you can see here in China, in India, Bangladesh, in Ecuador, and then the Philippines. So what I'm basically saying is that we have to look now in terms of looking at gender vulnerability, look at the place vulnerability, and governance vulnerability in terms of the intersections of the hazard exposure, the levels of vulnerability, capacity, and resilience of the place and of the city. I will not go into this because I think there are several publications I have on this. But really, in SICAR, in partnership with the National Resilience Council, we really strive. I think our job is really to bridge science, policy, and our practice next. And we always say that we can only do this if we practice three principles of transitory action research. That we must co-generate the knowledge with our stakeholders. In the process of doing so, we must create the capacities of scientists, policymakers, and practitioners, and this should lead to ownership and benefits. And really, with the National Resilience Council, we're really pushing for what we say integrated climate and disaster risk assessment approach, and we should insert this into the planning and action towards a resilient local governance and development systems. We must be integrative, we must be convergent in our pathways to resilience. And if you see there in the circle, I say there that, given all of these agreements, global agreements that the Philippine government is co-signatory, the role of the scientific and academic community is really to have a science informed, gender sensitive, and socially inclusive resilience planning. And we must be able, in the process of doing that, also resilience action can investing what we call the process of doing so should be used in terms of our land use planning, our comprehensive development plan, and the way annual investment planning is decided, and also the local climate action planning and the local seal of good government. Our job as researchers really should be focused on that, and collaboration with other public and private partnerships. I think we can be able to do that. We should be able to position resilience in a multidimensional way. So I'm pushing here what I call the men and women of SICAR and the National Resilience Council in terms of trying to produce these kinds of science that is engaged, collaborative, and we are ready to all our parties. Thank you very much. I think I always would like to end my presentation by saying that in all our work, in all our engagements and our practices, we must always be part of a larger goal, a larger dream of caring for some space that belongs to everyone, as Father Jet would say. We should always think of our work, our roles, as very part of creating a more climate resilient city, a city that cares for its people, a city that basically support towards a common future that we all would like to have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Porio. Now we officially begin our lectures, starting from Professor Mary Ann Ocampo. This may be a familiar face to the audience as she was in our first session of the lecture series, featuring an excellent discussion on engineering equitable resilience in Metro Manila. So Prof. Ocampo is a lecturer of urban design at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and she is also a principal at the Sasaki Associates, a multidisciplinary firm with integrated planning and design philosophy. So with her lecture entitled Centering Women in Resilience Planning and Design, let us welcome Professor Mary Ann Ocampo.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to be sharing my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. Great, so hello, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in discussing the important topic on gender and designing equitable and sustainable cities and communities. My name is Mary Ann Ocampo, and I am a lecturer of urban design at MIT, the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. I'm also a principal at Sasaki and have worked around the world and domestically on planning and design for cities and communities and institutions. My presentation, Centering Women in Resilience, Planning and Design, is really focused on foregrounding Filipino women in society and asking how we can integrate and design for women, especially in the recovery phase of disasters, learning from the humanitarian efforts and how those recoveries can actually plant seeds and be a foundation for how we think about longer term planning. I believe in connecting different sectors, whether it's the public, private, different systems, cultural, social, economic, political, and finding solutions that are about shared knowledge and at the critical intersections, understanding how we can make the biggest impact for our cities so that they are more resilient, that they are able to bounce forward when thinking about disasters. So for today, we're really going to talk about women in regards to these very particular predicaments. This framework for what I'm proposing about thinking in regards to equitable planning for resilience is really based off understanding resilience from what? In this case, thinking about climate resilience, climate change, natural disasters in the Philippines, and for whom the most, I think, vulnerable populations that we've been hearing about are the urban poor, but especially with a focus on women and girls. So climate change, we know, will affect people around the world, but in the Philippines, it is a major hotspot for natural disasters, given its geographic location, and those will continue to be increasing and being more frequent in affecting and impacting different communities. There is an average of 20 typhoons that touch down in the Philippines each year, and 50 of the most horrific typhoons and tropical storms in the country's history have occurred since 2000. So these storms pose especially high risk to informal urban dwellers living within the boundaries of the metropolis, along waterways and shorelines. So Metro Manila has an average of 11 to 20% of typhoons and tropical storms that pass directly over the capital annually, amplifying an already growing focus on disaster preparedness. So you can see here, looking at these maps, over time, from the 1950s, understanding where flooding is actually taking place, and seeing alone from the 1970s to the 1990s, the increase, but also in the 2000s, and then looking at 2020, how do we understand the impact of flooding and who does it really impact the most? In this case, in the bottom, you can kind of see those impacts in regards to the way that we're understanding the cost and the people affected. So, of course, we also realize that, even in this past year during a pandemic, and then understanding Typhoon Ulysses, or internationally known as BAMCO, hit Metro Manila, and more than 4,000 residents of the resettlement sites in Rizal were caught by surprise on that November day. And we're going to hear more about that later on. But my question is, how can the Philippines become more resilient to these typhoons, to the tropical storms, earthquakes, and other natural hazards? And how can communities, the urban poor, and especially women and girls in particular, be protected? So in my work with Stephen Gray, who teaches at Harvard, we've written a lot and studied a lot about the way in which we understand urban development, natural systems, and then the cultural systems at play in thinking about resilience. We believe and have written about the idea that citizens are only as resilient as their most vulnerable citizens. And in Metro Manila, the most vulnerable citizens are the urban poor, who occupy the social and spatial edges of society. Now, in this quote, we can see that people in poverty often live in substandard housing or in dangerous locations. They are less able to really escape disaster zones, and they are less likely to have savings, insurance, or other safeguards. We also know that rising inequality poses a real threat to continued prosperity in Asia, where an estimated 500 million people remain trapped in extreme poverty. Most of them are women and girls. So Stephen and I have previously discussed socio-ecological kind of approaches to urban design for urban resilience thinking. And we look to three basic elements that we think are the key ingredients to understand, which of course is looking at people, understanding who they are, what their gender identity may be, understanding the economics, the politics and culture, all those systems at play, and how those are really describing particular conditions and forces at play. We're also looking at the environment, understanding the ecology and the publicness of space and how those systems might work. We're looking at development and understanding the formal and the informal, and how we can maybe get rid of that kind of binary between the two, knowing that those two kinds of ways in which we understand the economy, the communities, and development actually go hand in hand and can be integrated. So for us, we define resilience as the ability for overlapping networks, systems, communities to anticipate and absorb disturbances and then bounce forward together to become more spatially, ecologically, and spatially kind of socially equitable. So in this work, that we're talking about today, I wanted to focus on understanding this approach through a holistic framing, but also understand it through a kind of lens of gender, and more specifically understanding it for women or those who identify as women, and how to really think about empowering these women to be part of an equitable process for future resilience planning. So my question is, how can gender equity, with a specific focus on women, influence this planning process? How can they be part of the process? How can we listen to the needs of women and what those burdens are for them, how they're disproportionately affected by storm events and by the other kinds of oppressive systems at play, as we think about the future city and future communities. So there are many lessons learned from Typhoon Haiyan, or Yolanda as it's known in the Philippines. And I think there has been great reports, and I think some of the women that are on this call listening have been part of those impressive processes for understanding the impacts of past typhoons and how the community needs were not met, and understanding how we can better equip ourselves for the future. There is a particular report I will refer to by Oxfam, which was about prioritizing social equity and disaster discovery, recovery, and resilience, and thinking about what women's needs were. So for me, it's understanding first, are there different vulnerabilities and impacts for women and men pre-disaster, during a disaster, and during recovery? And of course, what we have found through different reports, different surveys, different processes is, yes, there are different ways in which women and men are responding during these types of events. Findings have shown from Typhoon Yolanda affected areas that women and men responded differently to the typhoon event. Women and men were affected differently by Yolanda, and these differences were actually based on pre-disaster contexts of gender inequality, discrimination. In emergency responses were very different in the role that men played versus women. Women having a crucial role in taking care of other community members, and especially children and the elderly and the ill. So there are these different roles that we're seeing in regards to how women are working and contributing in society. And so one story that really came to life for me in the report that I had mentioned earlier, of Women After the Storm, Gender Issues in Yolanda, Recovery and Rehabilitation, was Nanny's story. And the story was the fact that she was 2 months pregnant during the typhoon and lived in a coastal barangay. When her family heard about the typhoon, she took heed of that warning, and they quickly evacuated to a designated evacuation area. Her husband, who was a fisherman, stayed at home because he preferred to watch over the house and the boat, as he was a fisherman. I would also note that Nanny had also been helping with the fishing business as part of the fishing and with the post-catch process. But Nanny's husband would not go to the evacuation center because he was safeguarding their assets. Nanny took her son to get the husband to evacuate because there were so many incoming texts that said it was going to be very bad, but he wouldn't follow at the time. And the story goes on to say that she decided to go back to their house and then force her husband to go with her. And at that time, he says, the sky is clear, you can see the stars. But finally, he did agree to evacuate. Now, the only thing that remained of their house in this story after Yolanda was one piece of material. So in this case, Nanny was focused on her family's safety. Her husband was protecting their physical assets and may have thought differently about the severity of the storm. In general, men and women may have different responses to a disaster event. So an important component to equitable planning is understanding livelihoods. And so for me, it's asking, how are women's contributions to the economy really acknowledged? How do women reflect on their individual livelihoods? And what we found is that women are engaged in a whole range of productive care and work, both inside and outside their homes. There should be targeted support to ensure that women's work is recognized and really, really, truly valued. So as you see in this table, you can see that both men and women play a role in the fishing industry before Typhoon Yolanda. Men are the majority of those workers who are fishing, but what you'll notice is that women play a major role in the fishing industry too, with a majority selling fish, a majority processing the fish, and then a majority really contributing in fish drying and repairing the nets and boats. But what's really, really interesting in this work that was in the report by Oxfam was that women themselves do not recognize the productive work that they do, although it is extremely crucial to their household, to the community, even before the typhoon arrived. So how do we recognize and acknowledge each woman's role within society and within their own contributions in their livelihoods? Now, another question is in regards to resettlement. As we think about all of the disaster kind of events that occur, knowing that communities are migrating. And in the last discussion, we talked about the in-city kind of migrations that occur so that people could really be close to their loved ones, their social networks, and understanding where those jobs are. So one question that I have is really, how do environmental systems, economic opportunities, and social networks become integrated for the planning and design of resettled communities? How are the resettlements and housing locations safe for women? How are we designing what that housing looks like, where it's located, and how it actually works? So past lessons learned from, again, Typhoon Yolanda, or even the flooding events that have occurred in Muntinlupa, we have done surveys, and surveys have gone out from the Oxfam group that there has been a lot of requests to, of course, think about resettlement and really understand how it's connected to livelihood. So in this case, seeing that people after the typhoon want to really make sure that we can, when considering relocation, it is about livelihood. It is about safety from other disasters that can take place. And it's about availability of basic services. What I've heard from my research is understanding those social networks, ways that we're thinking about safety and security for members of a household, in particular, thinking about women and girls, and understanding that safety from any kinds of forms of violence is really, really important. Access to information, and then understanding the need to ensure that men and women are granted equal housing, land, and property rights. What we'll also note here is that typhoon recovery in this great poster is more than a house. It's about jobs, education, health, infrastructure, and safety. And I would also note that women are more than the recipient of humanitarian efforts. They are active participants in society who are decision makers in their communities, have livelihoods that should be recognized, and also continue to play roles where they are caretakers for children and the elderly and should be recognized for those roles. So in my global practice, working at Sasaki, located in Boston, we do a lot of planning and design work internationally. And I just wanted to show briefly that, resettlement is part of a way of thinking about and strategizing new forms of community that can be safe and secure, and where we can provide the needed basic amenities in the way that we think about housing and the right to housing. So in our work, really focused on the capital city of Kabul, Afghanistan, working with the president there, we had to really understand and evaluate all the resettlement strategies that can take place. First, through the way that we consider the international, the national, and the city level coordination that must be taking place and thinking about those planning efforts. Second, understanding the actors and processes at the local scale of government. Third, working through implementation. And then, of course, evaluating the process and the evolution of growing settlements. There is land use oversight, hazard mapping to identify where sites are safe, and land assembly, and then of course community engagement and participation, so we understand what the needs are of the community that we are settling, and then thinking about the implementation and construction. So another question or a component for this planning work is really understanding health and well-being. And here I ask, how can planning support healthcare and safety for women? Reproductive health for communities must be addressed with immediate availability and access to health services. Thinking about community information, education, and awareness in regards to disasters and the environment, and being good stewards of that environment, which also benefits our health, is very important. Understanding and thinking about capacity building as it comes to all the kind of essential workers that we know are so important during this pandemic and during any kind of event is also very important. And of course, awareness of gender-based violence and finding ways to mitigate through acts and through services to help women and girls are very important. So at Sasaki, again, working in Kabul, which as the New York Times has talked about it as a socially conservative kind of Afghan culture that relegates women to hidden with subjugated roles, we had to find a way, working with the president, to understand how to talk about women in our planning work, how to really elevate those voices and understand that there are very particular needs for this particular population, which makes up half of the city. So there we look to ways to integrate how the plan could really accommodate health clinics, understanding the number of health clinics, healthcare clinics, proximity to healthcare and educational opportunities were part of the way that we plan. So mapping that regional kind of scale of where those services are and realizing that proximity is very important. We also thought about designing a city for women, entailing that, having it so that it entails understanding the social and the physical infrastructure that would actually be needed in existing neighborhoods, to really thinking about proposed new redevelopment that could occur with investment. So in this image, what you can see is the proposed concept of this network of amenities and services is integrated into the future city. So whether it's the mobility patterns of understanding safe areas where women can board buses, to understanding urban amenities, to looking at a women's center, vocational training, daycare facility, religious studies, medical care, or really understanding the accessibility in the outdoor recreational spaces that might be needed, again, health and well-being and socially to interact with each other. So last is finding ways that we can empower all women. How are women being acknowledged? How are they being promoted and empowered in their many roles that they already play? Promoting women, in this case, it's recognizing the significant role women play already in society, needing to see women's leadership beyond participation in activities, but also in their control of decision-making at all levels of planning, whether it's for an emergency response, recovery, or really thinking about the long-term planning in regards to thinking of relief after a disaster. So I'll just end with 4 major questions that begin to close the loop in the way that I understand this work, and relative to the kind of discussion I've had before on this platform, which is one, thinking about how can we integrate gender equity in this resilience planning and design work? How can we eliminate separations and distinctions between informal and formal communities? What are our roles as planners, as designers, policymakers, academics, and developers in this process? And then last, how do we really move from vulnerability to resilience by bouncing forward together? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mary Ann. We look forward also to the forum to hear from the audience if they have questions or they want to expound. So I'm happy to introduce next our keynote speaker, Dr. Anna Marie Karaos, or Dr. Jean Karaos, who is the Associate Director of the John J. Carroll Institute on Church and Social Issues, and the professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology in the Ateneo de Manila University. Dr. Jing is also a key advisor to the SICAR PH project. No? With her lecture entitled Women's Experiences During the Typhoon Ulysses. Let us welcome Dr. Anna Marie Karaos.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ina, for that introduction. Yes, this presentation will be looking into women's experiences during Typhoon Ulysses in 2 resettlement sites, both of them in Montalban, Rizal. These are in Casiglahan, Village 1, and Southville 8. The experiences will serve to highlight not only the concerns and vulnerabilities that the women have, the women who live in these resettlement sites, but also equally important, the housing policies and practices that have placed them in such a situation of greater vulnerability. This underscores what Tony earlier highlighted, namely the crucial role of governance in the agenda of reducing vulnerabilities and creating opportunities for greater resilience and inclusion, especially of women. Next slide, please. The next few slides will just be showing images now of what the resettlement, these are all from Casiglahan village, what this, these faces, certain faces in the Casiglahan village look like after Typhoon Ulysses, which occurred in November 12, 2020. It hit that area. So this is what happened to the housing, the government social housing. Some families have put up already second stories. This one and the other one on the background, because they have experienced floods previously. So this is a kind of adaptive housing. Next slide, please. This is another view. So, most of the houses have been really damaged severely, some totally damaged. So the question is, who will be shouldering the cost of repairing these houses, and whether the families will still be made to pay for the amortization of these houses despite the destruction that has happened to them. And you will see the women, the women are usually the ones who stay in the communities. The men go out to find the means to get livelihood. The women stay, and in this case, the debris has been left after several days, even more than weeks. No, in the community, some parcels have not been taken out, and so the women are the ones burdened with doing something about it. Next slide, please. This is another scene. You can see the mud that has remained in the streets outside the houses, and in the beginning, there were some equipment, government equipment, that tried to clear the area of debris and mud. But according to the residents, later on, still a lot of the garbage remained on the streets, and certainly the mud. And so the people just had to take care of removing them. Next slide, please. This is an example of an infrastructure that was built by the contractor of the housing development, because it's really contractors from whom the NHA procures these housing units. So when there was a flood that happened previously, the contractor built a wall, but then it collapsed. No, it wasn't strong enough. The residents said there were no reinforcing steel bars, no, in this wall, and so the wall had collapsed and this has to be rebuilt. Next slide, please. The findings that I will be sharing with you are drawn from a research, very, very rapid, quick research that was done by the JJCXC. And the objectives were to document the historical experiences of the women and the residents on the impacts of climate events in their area, in their communities, identify the hazards to which they are exposed and their vulnerabilities to these climate events, identify their needs for recovery and resilience building, review the procedures in the selection and development of resettlement sites, which are mainly the responsibility of the housing agencies, principally the National Housing Authority and the Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board, and of course also the local governments who are tasked with approving the subdivision plans and the subdivision projects that are built by private contractors. As well as the implementation of disaster preparedness and response in the two resettlement communities, as perceived and experienced by the community members. And finally, identify options for recovery and resilience building of the residents in these two sites. Next slide, please. Just a few facts about the resettlement site, so you will get an idea of the magnitude of the problem of vulnerability in these resettlement sites. Siglahan Village 1 has almost 10,000 housing units in them, not counting the informal housing that have been built in some areas of the resettlement site. Situated on a land with 85 hectares. The families that were relocated here came from mostly from the Pasig River because of this program, the Pasig River Rehabilitation Program, which was implemented starting in the late 1990s and until early 2000. There are also informal occupants in the community. For example, among those who participated in our FGDs were members of the group Kadamay that had occupied unoccupied housing units in the area, and also those that came from Payatas after the trash slide in July 2000, and some informal settlers in an area called Bukid Extension. In Southville 8, also in Rodriguez Rizal, there are 8,000 housing units on 35 hectares of land. The families here were transferred after Tropical Storm Ondoy in 2009. and from also those displaced by government infrastructure projects. In Kasiglahan village, at the time that this was built and developed, we still did not yet have a high sensitivity or awareness of geohazards and climate hazards. So it's understandable that that area did not really undergo a very thorough hazard assessment. But after Tropical Storm Undoy, we would have expected that the standards would have been much stricter as far as safety was concerned. But unfortunately, it seems that that's not the case. Next slide, please. So this is the map that was also shown by Mary Ann earlier, which shows the location of the 6 phases, the resettlement sites in Kasiglahan and Southville, where we conducted our focus group discussions. The focus group discussions were conducted actually by our partner NGO, the Community Organizers Multiversity, or COM, on the 3rd week of December. So this is already about a month or over a month after Typhoon Ulysses hit the area. And you will see, in terms of the elevation of the extent of flooding experienced in the area, some of our some of our participants came from those areas that were really deep in the floods, about about a meter high, but some are in those light colored brown areas, about just a quarter of a meter deep in flood. Next slide, please. The focus group discussion sought to get the residents' experiences of past disasters and their perceptions of the local government's disaster preparedness and relief efforts, from their perception and from their experience, and their capacity and options for recovery and resilience building. Next slide, please. This shows a map, a 5-year flood hazard map that was sourced from the DOST UP DREAM. And again, it shows the location of the 6 phases of these of the Kasiglahan and Southville resettlement areas, and a good number of them, well, at least 3, would be in the high hazard areas, and the others in the medium and low hazard areas. So the high hazard areas would be experiencing waters of higher than 1.5 meters, and the low would be just below half a meter, and the medium between half a meter to 1.5 to 1.5 meters. So it really looks like they are quite vulnerable. And this is 5-year flood hazard map. So there's a 20% probability that it would occur in a year. So in every 5 years, they would be seeing something like this. So this is obviously, the area is in the floodplain of the Marikina River. Okay, but we built huge resettlement sites on this floodplain. Next slide, please. This is a 20-year flood hazard map, and you will see that the red areas have expanded. So there's a greater area covered by the red areas, the high hazard, that will experience 1.5 meters and above of flooding. There's a small chance that this will occur in a year, but over a 25-year cycle, there's a high probability that they would experience this once, at least once within the 25 years. Next slide, please. The next slide will be showing a 1-minute video that that would illustrate what happened in these areas during the Habagat floods, in 2012. So that was only 8 years ago, and that is why some of the people have built the adaptive housing, because they learned that these floods would happen frequently, and so they built 2-story, 3-story structures. And you will see in this video that the housing is still relatively new. They look very different today. This is they have been just recently relocated, but this is what the people experienced. Okay, you may play the video, Ina.
Parang buhangin, parang ilog lang. Sorry, narinig niyo. Ayan! Tumatawid yung mga tao, oh. Ang lalim na ng...
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's not playing properly. But anyway, it was supposed to show the level of the flood in the streets. So it is a waist deep in the center of the streets. Ayan, okay.
Ang buhangin, pero ilog lang. Ay, sorry, narinig niyo.
They
Ayan.
try to save their belongings.
Yung mga tao, ang lalim na ng baka. Sa kasiglahan lang po matatagpuan yung dami yan. Kasiglahan yan. Oh, pinaikot-ikot mo. Ayan na nga yung mga taong... Kitang-kita natin na hanggang bewang na yung baha dito sa amin sa Kasiglahan, sa Rodriguez Rizal. Kung saan maraming mga taong nasalanta at nag-evacuate na sa iba't ibang lugar. Meron na rin namatay. Yan, binak nila. Meron na din dito mga natagpuang patay. Walo na yung, oo nga, may patay na nga. 8 na yung natagpuan.
Ganda sa taas! Tumabi naman kayo dyan!
Hindi ko pinapakita. Ang bilis naman ang ganyan, no? Pagdating doon sa ano, makikita rin nila. Ayun o, tumatawid o. Ayun, nakikita na.
Nandito na sa akin yan!
Sama na.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ina. Next slide. So I will be featuring some of these quotes from the women during the FGDs to show what have been the main concerns of the women. First of all, as Mary Ann pointed out, the family safety was number 1. So Rose said, inuna ko iligtas ang pamilya ko at isinakay ko na sa padyak. So they left the house altogether. They left the area just to be sure that they can go to a safe place. Eileen said, nung panahon na yan, nagugutom na ang mga anak ko at walang-wala kaming pera. Food was a major concern because they didn't have enough saved as far as food is concerned, and all of that also was got wet anyway. So food was really an important concern which the women had. And education, for example, Lucy said, ang una kong nakuha na gamit ay modules ng anak ko. She was so concerned about her child's education and also the health. Nag-aalala ako sa anak ko dahil kakagaling lang niya sa sakit. Next slide, please. Berna in Bukid Extension, this is informal housing, said, sinira ng asawa ko ang pinto para makaraan kami bitbit ang sanggol ko dahil tumataas na ang tubig. Again, the safety of the family came first. Nagdesisyon yung kaibigan namin na sirain yung grills para tumawid kami sa 3rd floor nila. The adaptive housing, 2nd floor, 3rd floor structures that were built also helped the neighbors find safety, in these structures. So it was not only for the families that built them, but also for the neighbors. Rosie said, ang mas mahalaga ay mailigtas ang mga bata. Again, the safety came first. Next slide, please. Suffering trauma was a common experience. Dina said, ninenervyos na kami kapag malakas ang ulan, natatakot na kami because these floods have happened more than once, and so they become really very, very stressed and anxious whenever it rains continuously. Kapag umulan ng umulan, may nervyos na kami. Yan sa amin. Stella said, ang talagang nakakaawa ay ang mga bata. And she also said, ngunit nagbibigay ito ng takot sa mga magulang at stress. Next slide, please. So in other words, mental health is really a concern too. Yung bigas, how did they cope? No? Sabi ni Dina, yung bigas na nalubog sa tubig, hinugasan lang namin ng maigi kasi wala kaming pagkukunan ng pagkain. Dahil wala talaga kaming makain. So they just washed it. Ang mga kapitbahay namin na may mataas na bahay ay nagpapaakyat. So this was a very good coping strategy. So to get the neighbors to also move in the additional 2nd floor and 3rd floor structures. Mirna said, nagagawa pa rin naming tumawa pagtapos umiyak. So this attitude of still being able to have the confidence that they will survive the crisis. And Nell said, tulad ng pagbibigayan ng pagkain o tulong, nagkakaroon ng suportahan sa isa't isa. May damayan at pagtutulungan. It's really the damayan and solidarity that people rely on during these very difficult times. Next slide, please. Rosel said, dahil na-demolish na sila sa Payatas, they came to the area so that they can have, a better housing. But they settled there informally, Bukid Extension. Juvie said, nangupahan dito sa bukid, kubo-kubo lang ang itinayo namin at pinapasok naman sila ng caretaker. Ang pagpunta ko rito ay dahil sa trabaho ng asawa ko. So livelihood was important and that is why they settled also in the area. So maybe in the adjacent areas of resettlement site, there are places that are still privately owned. Maricel said, may naririnig kami sa mga usap-usapan na bahain nga raw po ito pero wala eh. Kesa naman mangupahan kami, mas okay na ito. And so that was one incentive, no, why they chose to agree to be relocated, no, so that they can have their own place. Next slide, please. However, many felt that their situation had become worse, no, in the resettlement site. For example, Tricia said, inalis kami sa landslide, they came from the Payatas. Dinala naman kami sa mas delikadong lugar na laging binabaha. Nel, nabuhay tayo sa basura, mapapatay naman tayo ng baha. Dina, nandito na kami, doon lang namin naranasan na danger zone pala itong lugar namin. So we are realizing now that it's not only the places in Metro Manila, the danger areas in Metro Manila, but many of the places outside of Manila are also in very precarious, in very precarious areas. Kung alam lang namin ganito ang mangyayari, doon na lang sana kami sa tagiliran ng kalsada. That's Estela and Cheryl said, ang solusyon ay dapat magtaas na lang ng bahay, pero papaano kung wala na kaming pera? Not everyone can afford to put a second story or third story. Aalis na lang at maghahanap ng safe na lugar is how Letty saw how they would resolve this situation. Next slide, please. So among the burdens placed on them, sabi ni Dina, tulad noong lockdown, wala ding kinikita dahil mahal magtinda, tapos may laman man ang tindahan, tinangay naman ng baha. Hilda, ako hirap kasi apat ang iisipin kong anak na bubuhayin. So the burden of supporting the children also rests on the women, not just on the males. Ngayon, mag-isa kong kinakaya ang lahat because she was widowed at walang ibang naghahanap buhay. This is Rosie. Next slide, please. For Letty, ang kinikita ay napupunta lang sa swab test. Halos dahil buwan-buwan ang swab test, kaya wala nang halos kinikita. So the pandemic added to the costs or expenses, no, of the families. Mag-isang naghahanap buhay na lang si Nel, single parent ako at walang nakakatulong at may mga pinag-aaral pa. Next slide, please. Still, they did not lose hope. Nel said, madami ng trahedya ang nangyari, may pandemic pa. Malaki pa ang utang sa ospital, pero bangon lang. So this is the very resilient spirit, no, of the women and of the residents in the resettlement sites. So, para kay Tricia, mahalagang pamilya. Kahit paano buo ang pamilya, basta buo, babangon ang buo. Okay, next slide. Okay, so many of them did experience that these floods had been, the impact of these floods have been the worst that they experienced since Ondoy. They used to reside in danger areas previously, but now they are still experiencing danger in the resettlement sites. So I will not anymore read this in the interest of time. Next slide, please. Many participants said that they did not know that the hazards were present. No one explained this to them. So again, in the procedures, when we move people to resettlement sites, what information are they given? One said that they knew the area was prone to flooding, but they did not mind it because having a house was their most urgent concern. Okay, so even if people knew that there were those risks, they still wanted to have a house of their own. One of them said that they have gotten used to the floods, and that is why maybe some of them ignore the warning sirens, and others thought that the signal was for the curfew. So again, the information disseminated was not really that effective. So people did not understand what the warnings were for. Next slide, please. The protective infrastructure, which I already explained earlier. So because of the procurement system that it's the contractors that are partly responsible for maintaining the infrastructure in these resettlement sites. They sometimes tend to put up quite substandard infrastructure. Next slide, please. Adaptive housing, I've described that already earlier. So it's either a second story or some lofts inside the existing house, low attics. So that is how they adapt to the situation of frequent flooding. Next slide, please. They experienced the delays in the relief efforts from the local government. For example, in the case of the FGD participants, the relief assistance came after 5 days. So that's why the women, they had to resort to other ways of getting food for their families. Like many in Kasiglahan village, the participants did not see any rescue team deployed by the local government. Maybe the rescue went only to very few areas in the resettlement sites because of the hugeness of the site. Not all could really be assisted on time. Next slide, please. So recovery would be difficult because of the pandemic, because of the loss of livelihood and the added expenses. And coping with the impacts of the flooding would be a struggle for those especially who lost their belongings, especially if these belongings were being used for livelihood purposes. And recovering the lost assets would take a long time for those who lost their jobs because they could not find sources of income because of the pandemic. Next slide, please. The families who are already vulnerable were plunged into deeper crisis in terms of health because of the COVID-19, which is still spreading. And it is a common concern among the participants. They recognize it. They don't think that it's really a small problem, but they're caught really between the vulnerability to COVID and the need for livelihood. The disaster had negatively impacted also the mental health of many residents, especially those who could not find work, those who have children to support and they have no means to do that, and those who are pregnant. So, they relied on relief goods and donations up to even a month after the flood. And so they showed the limited capacity of some residents to recover and start anew. Next slide, please. People had their own perceptions also of what contributed to the floods. The residents attributed the massive flooding to deforestation and the quarry project that they know operates in the upstream of the tributary. So in other words, no matter how prepared the families are to secure their homes and belongings, they try to do as much as they can to do that and to evacuate when needed. The flooding would continue to happen, to threaten their community, and could worsen if these surrounding developments like the quarries and some subdivision projects continue to proliferate and are not the impacts are not mitigated. Next slide. So just a few policy recommendations, which really mostly have to do with the governance mechanisms. The first is to review existing resettlement site selection policies. I think I have already pointed out that when the government procures resettlement developments, resettlement sites, not just the site, but the complete housing, these have to be really assessed very carefully in terms of geohazards, more strictly now than had previously been done. There's also room for improving the LGU readiness and responsiveness. The local governments, both the municipal and barangay, can still improve their disaster preparedness, particularly in obtaining timely information from the weather agencies and executing early warning, making sure that the communication, the correct information reaches the people, and have greater capability for rescue and relief operations that can be delivered in a timely manner, and ensuring the readiness of evacuation centers and facilities and designing them properly. Third is adopt a systems approach in planning. As pointed out earlier, the LGU must also conduct investigation and monitoring of the various development activities that are happening within its jurisdiction near these resettlement sites. Now, among them, the other subdivision projects and quarrying activities to assess their geophysical impacts. Next slide, please. The need for a protective infrastructure, this cannot be left only to the developer or to the contractor. The DPWH, we feel, must come in and undertake a study of flood mitigating infrastructure that would be needed to secure these communities from future flooding events and give priority to their construction at the soonest possible time to avert the recurrence of flooding in the near future. And finally, adjust the amortization policies because amortization imposes an added financial burden, considering that the damage to their houses and assets had been caused by the exposure to hazards, which was not their fault. Existing policies on the payment of amortization, which adds a financial burden, should be adjusted so as not to unduly add to their burdens, which they are already experiencing. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, no, Doc Jing, and thank you again to Professor Mary Ann for her lecture earlier. No, so for this next session, I would like to call back Dr. Emma Porio to moderate and introduce our panel of reactors. So, Doc Emma.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jing and Mary Ann, for those excellent presentations. We're very fortunate and blessed today for being blessed with distinguished speakers, highly accomplished panel of reactors. For the first reactor, we will have Congressman Kiko Benitez. He is the chair of the Housing Committee and Urban Development. I'm very grateful to him because I know he had some activity in his district now, but he basically came back to us to attend. So, Congressman Benitez, it's your floor. We really highly value your input to this discussion that we have now. And take the floor, Congressman Benitez.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Can I be heard, Dr.
Yes,
Emma?
yes.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I may not be able to stay too long because I do still have another event ongoing at the today. Right now, as the culmination exercises across the district for Women's Month. But having said that, I'd like to thank Dr. Emma for inviting me to this forum. It is my pleasure to listen and learn from two such distinguished women scholars, Professor Mary Ann Ocampo and Dr. Jing Karaos, and from my co-panelists. I think it is wonderful to end Women's Month with this clear celebration of women brain power and a discussion of women's role in housing and resettlement governance. I feel that conversations like this are crucial in building inclusive, sustainable, and resilient communities. As pointed out, the Philippines sits on the ring of fire and the typhoon belt. Floods, storms, and earthquakes exacerbate the vulnerability and the condition of precariousness and precarity of families relocated to off-city resettlement sites, as in the case of Typhoon Ulysses in November. For the longest time, the government has been relocating informal settlers living along waterways or affected by infrastructure projects in Metro Manila to off-city resettlement sites, such as the ones in Rizal that has been part of this morning's discussion. But the lack of infrastructure and services to support basic needs and the lack of opportunity for gainful employment and sustainable livelihood in off-city resettlement sites have driven many families further into poverty. These conditions have now become even more exacerbated by the current recurring now disasters, particularly from typhoons and from floods. So that the condition of the families seem to be actually worse off than they were in the danger zones within Metro Manila. Partly, this is why I filed the bill in Congress to enforce a shift in government housing policy to ensure that informal settler families affected by the clearing of easements in waterways and development projects in Metro Manila are provided with preferably on-site or in-city housing as a priority. This bill also strengthens the coordination between the sending LGUs and the receiving LGUs in cases where in-city resettlement is absolutely not feasible or not possible. to ensure that there is adequate support for receiving LGUs to absorb and provide the basic services to the families relocating into their jurisdiction. This bill has passed through Congress uh, for the for third reading, and we're now hoping that it passes through Senate so it can be signed into law. I also filed a resolution calling for an inquiry precisely on the issues that Dr. Jing brought up, on the site selection process and housing design standards of the National Housing Authority, following the flooding in the NHA resettlement sites in Rizal due to Typhoon Ulysses. So, Dr. Jing, your recommendations we are already pursuing. This is, after all, in line with the oversight function of Congress. I understand that by policy, the geohazard mapping is part of the site selection and is already mandated in the National Resettlement Policy Framework. The NHA actually has issued guidelines on this, but we need to make sure that their commitment on paper is translated into actual compliance, no? Not just for the NHA, but for the LGUs as well. After all, the right to adequate housing constitutes basic entitlements, including standards for habitability, and the government should conform with the standards on the housing structure and location to guarantee the safety of occupants and provide adequate space and protection from both natural and health hazards, including ideally mental health. No? We don't want to be building and rebuilding houses year in and year out as substandard housing deteriorates or is damaged by the natural disasters. We don't want to keep on relocating people from Metro Manila to Rizal, Cavite, Laguna, and Bulacan, only to see them going back to Manila because there are no prospects for economic mobility in relocation sites. Off-city housing with no adequate infrastructure and services only perpetuate the cycle of vulnerability in circumstances of increasing precarity because of the current environmental crisis, especially since floods and typhoons will increase both in frequency and in intensity. We want to both break the vicious cycle of poverty and increase resilience and sustainability facing basically climate change, not mitigation, but adaptation. We want our people, especially women, a permanent and lasting break from poverty and vulnerability with provisions for both resilience and wellness. As showed by Dr. Jing's study, women carry the burden of managing domestic challenges of relocation and periods of economic and psychosocial distress. As such, the needs, interests, and standpoints of women should be crucial and central to all our housing interventions and plans. As Professor Ocampo has argued quite convincingly, women have to be part of the planning process for a holistic approach towards a planning that is more resilient and a sustainable future. Women have traditionally been at the center of the oikos, no? The Greek word for family and household, the root of the eco in economics and in ecology. As previously the president, Dr. Emma of Philippine Women's University, I used to always say that the term home economics was a oxymoron and redundant, since home and economics should be considered as coming from a single root. The proposal that listening to women in the planning process provides us with insights into the needs and burdens of the home, not just the family and not just the house, as a system of needs and a system of actual people and family members, like children's need for care and basic services, the children's need for protection from mental stress, for open spaces and general wellness and so on, I think it should be well taken. This argument forces us to shift our focus, but also enjoins us to think about the relationship between our housing and urban planning with the environmental conditions with which our settlements must contend. After all, the concept of human settlements arises from the United Nations Environmental Program. In many ways, this was the essence of the gender and development framework that is already in the law. Can we then make households and families, particularly from the standpoint of women and their concerns, the basis of our development plans, as our excellent presenters have already pointed out today? How do we galvanize the holistic approach that women's insights provide, both for the infrastructural ripple effect, perhaps, for development of housing projects, as well as the psychosocial and social development components that generally tends to be the purview of women's concerns. The National Resettlement Policy Framework already provides that, quote, resettlement programs, projects, and processes must be gender sensitive, inclusive, and participatory, close quote. As also the Magna Carta for Women, which mandates the state to, quote, consult women and involve them in community planning and development, especially in matters pertaining to land use, zoning, and relocation, close quote. Even the NHA, under Memorandum Circular number 2017-033, has required internal units to conduct gender analysis to identify gender issues that any proposed policy intends to address, or issues arising from the implementation of existing policies. As I have said, commitment in paper should be translated into actual compliance. And as the presenters have already shown us, we have very, very far to go in terms of turning these kinds of laws, memorandum orders and circulars, policy statements into actual effects on the ground. So we must monitor the proper implementation of these policies. I also filed a resolution declaring a housing crisis to address the broader issues in housing backlogs nationwide. The resolution calls for a comprehensive housing program that leverages and maximizes idle government lands, particularly within the NCR region, for the purpose of constructing in-city public housing, perhaps in mixed-use developments, in an attempt to leverage and open up, right? Apparently recurring underfunding of the housing sector. The Committee on Housing and Urban Congress is also working on consolidating several bills that will devote regular funding for housing programs. The main proposal from the bills that were filed is to allocate 135 billion pesos annually for a wide range of housing programs. We shall see if this will be passed into law, but the committee is currently discussing it. Also pending in the committee is the bill mandating a permanent local housing office and or a multi-sectoral housing board to craft local shelter plans which will guide LGU programming and spending as it dispenses additional funds from the Mandanas ruling that will be executed starting 2022 and hopefully provide clearer and more sustainable longer-term planning frameworks for the LGUs moving forward. So along with our call for new investments in housing, we also call for shelter agencies to adopt the People's Plan in the design and location of housing projects. Participatory planning is at the heart of development and highlights the human in human settlements, which grounds development in terms of our basic psychological and sociological needs and our relationship with our natural and social environments. And who does better in articulating human needs? Who juggles the responsibility of both earning income and managing the household, feeding the children, sending them to school, taking care of them when they are sick? I would have to agree with the presenters this morning that this generally falls on the burden generally falls on our women to straddle, if you like, the domestic, private, and the public spheres. As what our keynote speakers have already discussed, we need to build inclusive, sustainable, and resilient communities. And women play a key role in this process of turning houses into homes and homes into parts of communities. So we cannot do this without putting people front and center of the settlements planning and development. Ang sabi nga po ng tatay ko sa Ministry of Human Settlements dati, higit sa lahat, tao. Kung pwede lang, para po sa inyo, dadagdagan ko po ito. As we move forward with realigning our housing policies and programs with human rights, and human development perspectives to the rights of the city. Kasabay po dapat ng pagsulong ng ating mga komunidad ay ang pagsulong ng kababaihan. In summary then, in building inclusive, sustainable, and resilient communities, dapat higit sa lahat tao at dapat abante babae. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat.
Maraming salamat, Congressman Benitez. And what a refreshing response from a government official. I'm very happy that you articulated it very well. As we always said in the Philippines, we have very excellent laws. The challenge is really implementing it accordingly. So, Congressman Benitez, I know you have to go, but thank you very much. I'm very happy that you have put the women at the center of our planning and development. Our next reactor is Jessica Soto, Country Director of We Effect Philippines. Ms. Jessica leads the group in terms of advancing their advocacy for 1 million.
Yes, ma'am. I'm still here. I'm listening.
Okay. Ms. Jessica is basically responsible for leading her group for 1 million housing by 2030 that is gender sensitive and climate resilient housing settlements. Okay, Jessica?
Thank you po, Doc Emma, and to our previous speakers and lecturers. Hi, Cong, Kiko. Nagkita na naman tayo. I'm so glad to be part of this webinar. And my reaction would probably focus on 4 main points. No? One is housing as a fundamental socio-economic and cultural rights. Number 2 is a robust policy environment on land banking and financing for affordable housing. 3 is on gendered architecture and green engineering for resiliency. And 4th would be the people's participation within the public, private, and people partnership. I think Kong Kiko has very well explained how policies should be crafted. But let me view housing as a basic human right, and I will be speaking more on broad strokes that our basis for concretizing this at the national level is the UN Habitat Agenda since 1976, which called for governments to commit to adequate shelter and all sustainable human settlements. So the UN Habitat Agenda is actually developed every 20 years lang. So it means that, in 20 years, there should be great leaps in addressing the housing issues. And then you have the economic, social, cultural rights, but I will focus more on the committee setting up a minimum standards. So si Ma'am Jean kanina have mentioned legal security, availability of resources, affordability, habitability, accessibility for our PWDs, the location, which is near their economic environment, and the cultural adequacy, Philippines being a multi-ethnic country. And then, of course, you have the Millennium Development Goals, which has a call for cities without slums. And I would remember at the time that many countries have actually targeted, addressing their slum issues. Then you have the new urban agenda in 2016, which will end until 2036. And that will serve as the new vision for our cities and municipalities. No? Of course, SDG 11 in 2017 says we leave no one behind. No? And you have SDG 17 and SDG 11. Concretizing this at the national level, I think we have to look up to our government as the duty bearer. No? They should be able to streamline processes and documentation for affordable housing. In our experiences, our housing projects has to produce voluminous documents. And more often than not, community organizations, do not even know how to produce those documentation. There are available evidence-based studies, best practices to replicate, and new technologies to utilize. So we must optimize them. So si Ma'am Ms. Ocampo kanina have shared with us as well about this matter. But under pandemic, the stay at home to save lives policy does not resonate well with at least 6.8 billion Filipinos. So we have to be proactive and aggressive to build more resilient housing and inclusive, of course. Focusing on gender, and housing resiliency, women and men have different housing needs. Women and girls must have secure space in the design of the house to be free from some forms of violence against women. What has not been shared a lot in many of the discourses is actually the increasing cases of incest. So these things happen, in very small spaces. Um, Many green technology materials are now available as well, and they are more cost effective in the longer term. So then you have to look at the financial side. We have to also maybe review existing laws, UDHA in 1992, because maybe they're not so responsive anymore nowadays. And I am really hoping that Kiko Benitez, Cong Benitez as a bill will be passed. No. Designs must also be responsive for members with disabilities. Sadly, PWDs remain to be invisible, and we see that, in the housing designs. Um, I think we have been talking about partnerships. So from public and private, what we say, it has to be public, private, and people partnerships. Housing for the poor has become a complex problem globally. Therefore, there is an urgency that all stakeholders work together. The SDG must be localized in 10 years. The UN Habitat Agenda providing us the guidepost to deliver adequate housing in 20 years. The government has the required resources. The private builders has the technological expertise. Some CSOs has a little bit of both, but we need mass adequate housing now. And the brick by brick of building houses will not be able to catch up on the demands of the so-called down market. For our share, we effect as loans are 1 million housing by 2030 during UN Habitat Day in 2019. And we were able to bring together key shelter agencies, the organization for socialized housing developers in the Philippines. So this is our small contribution, and we enjoin everyone to work together. So in conclusion, I'm just showing you um, some of our efforts to contribute to the demand of the housing backlog in the country. Um, I think there is also some um, guidelines on how we can measure, or what we call benchmark, that we are actually building adequate housing. Of course, the UN has all this into their resources. So I think it's really good to just see whether we are compliant to it. No, just like what Mom Emma said, that we are so good at signing up all these international treaties at the international level. We have also some laws, some maybe not so good at the national level, but we have to be compliant. So in ending, Lailani Farha of the UN Special Rapporteur says the right to housing means more than just a roof over one's head. It should be seen as the right to live somewhere in security, peace, and dignity. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Jack, for all those insights. Our next speaker is my good friend, Mian Ignacio. We've been together in Ateneo long time ago, but now she is now the general manager. Let me get this clear, Mian, your long name. Maria Ana de Rosas Ignacio, general manager for Kasaganaka, and they're really doing wonderful initiatives there at Caloocan and other urban poor communities in Metro Manila. Mian, thank you very much for sharing with us, and I know you're very busy, but thank you very much for coming here, and please share with us your insights in terms of working with the women on the ground and their livelihood. Thank you, Mian.
Salamat, Emma. And it's a pleasure to be with this group, no, and share the our contribution to the issues that you have mentioned or we've been discussing this morning. So this is a simple slide deck that I prepared just to introduce the organization and the things that we do on the ground. So first, this is the organization, and Kasagana Ka is well, the vision is to help create vibrant communities. And vibrant communities, as mentioned by Tony earlier, is really a completely addressing the different requirements or needs of the community. And the wish is for the organization that we form to be really fully alive, where infrastructures for both uh, the physical and the human or the social infrastructures exist. Kabuhayan sa ganap na kasarinlan is a credit and savings cooperative. No? Kasagana Ka, well, it has well, let me see there's a slide here that shows, okay, let's remove. No? So Kasagana Ka is a shortcut for kabuhayan sa ganap na kasarinlan. So the first two letters form kasagana ka, which means well, wealth for all or development for all. So, but the kabuhayan means livelihood. We start with livelihood. And these are our 5 programs, and it would match with the SDGs. No? And also I was happy when Tony was explaining the NRC, there is almost a one-to-one matching of what their own programs with the programs of our cooperative. Our cooperative provides financial products and services. We are actually a member or a sister organization of other organizations that provide the social programs. So we focus on finances. So one is the livelihood and enterprise development. And we have different windows for each of the financial product or programs. So we started small loans to them. They don't need to have their own enterprise already, as long as they have an interest to put their small livelihood source. We also approach members or interested members, even if they have work. That's why we have a K trabaho or K employed window for those interested to join the cooperative, even if they have their own employment source. The second program that we have is for education, training, information. We believe that the women of the community also should be given a chance to develop their own. So it's not their own selves and not just their children. Most of the time, the loans for education is for children or grandchildren. But we encourage our members, if they want to pursue equivalency program or if they want to finish their own high school or college education, to avail of the loans at a very good rate, so that they can finish their education if they want to. For health and wellness, we think that, and this is very important now, we have a program with them where we conduct with partner clinics and hospitals near the area. We conduct yearly physical checkup, and with that, they keep instead of a baby book, we call it a nanay book, where they keep their health records. And most of the time, the mother would rather have the husband and the children have their checkup, and they would relegate their own health at the end. We always tell them, no, you should put yourself first, because you're the one who would be taking care if your family members get sick. So we have that, and we provide loans for if they need minor surgical procedures or medicines, or for their eyeglasses, and for dentures or dental prophylaxis. So we also provide that. We tie up with other the enterprises, private enterprises like the one for the glasses, so that we pay for the glasses, and then they simply give us regular payments instead of them going to the provider of those eyeglasses or medical medical supplies. And the fourth one, which I think is well into or relevant into what we're discussing, is the security shelter and safety program. So we provide loans for incremental housing. We cannot provide one big lump sum because our source of funds is really the savings of our members and some funding partners that provide short-term loans. So we can also only provide short-term loans from 1 to 2 years. So they can borrow for the construction, renovation of their houses. Initially, most of the renovations are for putting up tiles or painting their houses. But after we had a tie-up 5 years ago with Habitat and with Build Change, we now move into encourage the nanays to go into designing, making their house resilient and designing it in such a way they can weather the storm or the flood is often present whenever there's a storm. You know? In fact, the housing program started as immediately after Ondoy, and we found out that many of them would require going to the second story. So we encourage them, our members. Then we were organized as a microfinance NGO before we became a cooperative. Um, we encourage our client beneficiaries then to borrow funds to put up a second story or to at least improve the setup of their house or the construction of their houses. So we also have the partnership with Build Change afforded us a training capacity building for our socioeconomic officers for assessment of housing loans and also for they provided us with modules on how to do proper estimate for improving the resiliency of their houses. Because just putting up a second floor is not that easy. You have to make sure that there's structural integrity before they put up additional stories. So it's security because historically our organization is actually a child of an NGO into housing and um, security of tenure, you know. And we found out, when they win the land and they need to amortize, oftentimes they could not because they have no source of livelihood. So they have to return to again being evicted from that property. So we said livelihood is a key component. No? So that's our first step in our ladder out of poverty. But security, for buying or paying, providing a down payment for a piece of property or lot, and then the construction of houses, be it incremental, and then for safety because we organize our members into centers, and we ambition that each center would have a safety cadet. Similar to how we have organized our health and wellness program, each center, we have already trained, at least one set, each center will have a health cadet who could take basic vital signs, for all members of the center. And lastly, we have the social protection program. Here we have a tie-up with both our NGO, the Kasaganaka Development Center, and our Kasaganaka Mutual Benefit Association that provides microinsurance to our members. Many members are already about to get out of that poverty threshold, but because of death in the family or sickness, they again go below the poverty line. So having social protection or insurance for the family is a must. It's very important. Now, this is just to show you our different sites. Okay, so if you will notice, our areas are in, sorry, our are in relocation areas. I was having some exchange in the chat box with Attorney Junefe, and I was telling him, oh, we should again get together because our programs are actually in relocation areas. So we, from Metro Manila with Caloocan and Quezon cities as the localities with the biggest number of urban poor communities. So that's one of our original or old sites. And then we have for Caloocan 4,400. Similar with Quezon City, we have 4,400 members in those cities. And then we have also so that comprise the central sector of Casaganaka. And then for the north, where all the older location areas are, starting with San Jose del Monte, Bulacan, or Sapino, Asapang Palay, we have 10,000 members in Bulacan. For the south, we have Cavite, around 3,000 members. And then we also have another big relocation area is Rizal, and we have 12,000 members in Rizal. So the picture shown by Dr. Jing Karaos of Montalban or Rodriguez housing site, many of them are also members of Pasaganaka. So we know how bad it is in that area whenever there's a strong typhoon affecting the country. Now we also have some in Pasig, in other cities of NCR, that's Pasig, Muntinlupa, Parañaque, and Las Piñas. Okay. So let me just show you the effect of the pandemic on our program and the lives of our members. So we had by the end of 2019, almost 42,000 members of the cooperative. At the end of 2020, that's December, it went down to 37,885. Okay. Our microinsurance program or mutuals service, it's a family insurance. So both the member is insured, the family receiving higher claims, the husband is insured, and then 5 children are insured below the age of 21. So initially, it was just the member wife who would get the insurance. And then after we went through this series of gender sensitivity training, and way back 2010, we said, no, the husband is so lucky to get a bigger claim than if the wife dies, but the wife will get smaller claims. So we said, okay, the husband need to get a separate insurance, so the wife will also get a similar amount. So we have started designing our programs in such a way that the gender lens is there. We're using our gender lens to design it. And in fact, our unit of development, the measure of development, is not just the nanay or the mothers anymore, because it's overburdening the mothers. We say, no, our unit of development should be the entire family, and all members of the family should be encouraged to contribute to the development of the family and the community. So that once you view it from the gender lens, then your measure, your metrics would really change. So before, it was our numbers would show the different programs and the number of loans we provided for each of the programs I described earlier, and the portfolio size for them, for each of the programs. But now in 2020, we had to focus on different projects so that we can revive the livelihood of the members. We have to start, as I have earlier explained, we have to start first with livelihood. Health and the other concerns will take a backseat, like for example, education. Before, education is our second highest loan portfolio. But during the pandemic, education for the children take a backseat because it is livelihood and health that would take the front seat for the families. And therefore, we had to go into projects like Project Karinderya, where we partner with different organizations so that they can revive the small eateries and provide subsidized meals to the very poor in their communities. So I don't know if you see it on the screen, by 2019, we had a portfolio size of 1.2 billion. We were hoping that by 2020, when we did the planning, we would reach around double that, more than 2 billion. No? But what happened in 2020, it went down 50%. So our portfolio by end of 2020 is only 687 million, but I mean that's the amount disbursed, the loan disbursed, but that portfolio is still in the above 300 million level. Okay. So it's very challenging for us now for the cooperative because of the lockdown and the increasing incidence of COVID positive. Now, this is just to show you because we're going into importance of using science and technology in addressing the issue of gender, environment, and housing resilience. So I just want to, this is a shout out for NRC, the team of Malu and Tony, and of course Xavier University, who provided the skill to our managers. No? Before it was simply just pinning. Now, this is our first attempt at mapping with assistance of our collab partners. It's simply mapping the eateries of our members and the incidence of COVID. No? And it's funny because they say it's the poor who started it. Excuse me, but it started early in April. There are more COVID cases in the gated communities and fewer in Payatas, in Batasan. This is in Quezon City. And the experience of 2020 taught us to really value data and mapping, and more importantly, tying up with the local government units and other CSO or civil society organizations. So we have a tie-up right now with Caloocan City. We just had a meeting last Monday, inviting their team to work with us, the cooperative, our satellite office in Caloocan, to appreciate really what's happening in Caloocan. I don't know if I have the time to quickly show the map that our managers prepared. Do we still have time for that?
Quickly.
Okay. So if that's the case, then maybe I am very poor with technology. Maybe Ina can show the map So this is prepared by one of our managers. You know, our managers are also from the community. They are they live in urban poor communities, and this is just to show you. Maybe we can make it fast, Ina, and then focus on there's that map that shows how close the different houses are. So this is a mapping. That's our satellite office with our logo. And then we map where our members are. We map the often flooded areas during storm season. And then next, Ina. And then maybe we can go faster. This is the one I would like to show. So before that, this would show the structure. The before that, yes, that one. How close the houses are. So if the 4 dapat or the protocols in COVID management, it has to have proper ventilation. But how can you have proper ventilation if if the houses are like this? Okay, so this is one thing that we need to do something about, the design of the settlement communities and making sure that health is not taken for granted. No? So next slide, whatever we call that more. So that's another barangay, more space. That's another barangay beside Bagong Sila. And these are photos similar to what you've already seen when it comes to typhoon season. I need not explain that, Ina. Then we go to the next. Let's go to the next. This is it. This is the last one.
Yes.
Okay. Sige, Ina. Salamat. So, let's go back. So I want to end. We have our attempts at using technology to address the concerns that we are discussing since the first speaker. But it is really very challenging. But I would like to end my show with some slides because we're talking of the mothers, and in we believe that we cannot change the community of if the women of the community are not happy. Similarly, if you want a happy family, make sure the mother is happy, the wife is happy. And therefore, our approach to development starts with
Listen, men.
empowering. We should also be happy because it will be a sad family if both the husband and wife no, are not happy. But I think the empowerment of women, especially because of historical, realities, no, then and you listen to even the design of the house, no, where the kitchen will be, where the toilets will be. No? So these are our. Well, I miss this because we do this every year. No, at the start of the year and at the end of the year, we have our Christmas parties, and of course they make it a career to really perform in front of their of their co-members of the cooperative. So it's a fun activity for us, but because of the COVID. Rep Benitez, Cong Benitez mentioned about mental health. So this is one mental health exercise that we're not able to do with our members. And I simply look at these pictures and it uplifts my spirit. So I give to you the microphone. Salamat.
Thank you very much, Mian. Thank you. I really want everyone to hear those things that you said. So thank you very much. We will now call Attorney Junefe Gilig Payot, the Executive Vice President of the Social Housing Corporation and a faculty of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And I would like to tell people I'm very happy that Attorney Junefe Tim taught with me 2 weeks ago gender and environmental rights, and then gender and climate justice in the Ateneo Law School. So here you are. So thank you, Attorney Jay. Go ahead.
Hello, good morning. Thank you, Doc Emma. Let me know. Okay, now can you see?
Yes, we can see it now.
So thank you again, Doc Emma. While Congressman Benitez is still here, let me express my gratitude when I heard that they are planning for the allocation of bigger budget for housing under this new Congress that he is a part of. I think because that's one of the items in the wish list that you will find at the end of this presentation. So I work for the Social Housing Finance Corporation, and it's a GOCC. It's a GOCC, and it implements one of the longest running housing programs in the country, which is the Community Mortgage Program, or the CMP. And the title of my reaction this morning is From Vulnerability to Resilience Through a Systems Approach to the Provision of the Right to Adequate Housing. And this really combines one of the main policy recommendations of Dr. Karaos and one of the main questions that Professor Ocampo posed to us earlier in her presentation. Again, I work for the Social Housing Finance Corporation. Thus far, we have assisted over 400,000 informal settler families through loans amounting to 24 billion, and this consists of over 3,000 projects. So again, as I have mentioned earlier, among the 5 recommendations of the policy brief presented by Dr. Karaos, I think the one overarching recommendation that encapsulates all the rest is the need for a systems approach in planning that considers not only the physical hazards, but also especially the economic and the social situations of the families that will be resettled, and how these dimensions, these multiple dimensions interact with each other. Either they pull each other up or they pull each other down. So any resettlement policies that will be crafted, as recommended also by Dr. Karaos, needs to fully consider this multi-dimensional framework. And I believe that we need to agree on this if we are to answer the question posed by Professor Ocampo earlier on how do we move from vulnerability? How do we bounce forward from vulnerability to resilience how do we bounce forward from vulnerability to resilience? And this is very consistent. This multi-dimensional approach is very consistent, no, with some of the IPCC reports, this multidimensional framework, which describes climate change vulnerability as a function of exposure, sensitivity, and also adaptive capacity. At the risk of oversimplification, the first two elements, exposure and sensitivity, would pertain to the geophysical aspect, while adaptive capacity would pertain more to the socio-economic aspect. It would include livelihood, the status of the individuals, the status of the people in the community. Of course, we know that they reinforce each other. For instance, people may not be able to improve livelihoods to increase adaptive capacity if their sites are hazard prone, okay, to start with, and not conducive for livelihoods. So without income, also, they will not be able to build more sturdy houses and sturdy structures that lessen the sensitivity of their existence, I mean, of their material well-being. In any case, so our aim should be, if we are to improve resilience, is to lessen exposure and sensitivity while strengthening the adaptive capacity of people, of communities. And of course, we cannot neglect gender as a cross-cutting issue, considering its intersectionality with other social locations of individuals that may produce differential vulnerabilities to climate change. So it's really important also to integrate gender equity as one of the more important social locations that is determinative of people's vulnerability. Neglecting this holistic framework, these multiple aspects of vulnerability and resilience can lead to what is called the ratchet effect, no? The ratchet effect of combined climatic and non-climatic stresses on impoverishment. And this is really an idea of Chambers from the University of Sussex, which I have tried to revise a bit, no, by adding the climatic stresses. No? Because according to him, those who are very vulnerable economically can easily slide down to a poverty trap that they will find very difficult to get out of. So I simply added the climatic stresses, no? which can worsen the cascading effect or the ratchet effect of vulnerability. So these climatic and non-climatic stresses can combine to cause impoverishment that many households will not be able to get out of, and therefore it can undermine their adaptive capacity and make them perpetually vulnerable if nothing is done, especially by way of science-based and evidence-based intervention. And this will have serious consequences on their multidimensional vulnerability and also on multidimensional inequality. Now, let me just, okay, and of course, all of this interact with the social locations of individuals, their gender, their ethnicity, okay, which can either undermine their vulnerability or lessen it, no? Depending on the interventions that will be made. Let me just walk you through some of the legal foundations on housing. Firstly, starting with the 1987 Constitution. Please take note that this provision on urban land reform and housing may be found in Article 13 of the Constitution, which speaks of social justice and human rights. So it really has a strong social justice, equity, and rights dimension to it, no? This issue of housing. And that is why it's in the Article 13 of our Constitution. So it is really a matter of justice and equity, and especially with the addition of climate change justice, the equity dimension of housing becomes even more important. And because it's also a human rights issue, we have to recognize that the government is a duty bearer, as already mentioned by Jessica earlier. And we need to ensure that we uphold the right to adequate housing, especially because it facilitates the acquisition of other rights, like the right to health. And we know this very well now, more than ever, no, with this pandemic. It also facilitates the right to livelihood if housing is located in an area with a lot of economic opportunity. And also, it can facilitate the acquisition of a right to privacy, especially of women and girls. And we find expression of this constitutional duty in several laws, especially the local government code, okay, which mandates the local government to set aside land for the benefit of the poor and the landless and make an inventory of suitable sites for socialized housing where there is basic services, where where there are opportunities for livelihood and employment and other economic opportunities. So that's in the local government code. And this is also echoed in our Urban Development and Housing Act of 1992, which came right after the local government code. And more recently, in 2019, we have this law creating the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development, or the DSHUD Act, which speaks of the people's plan, which should be formulated by the people themselves. So it has it forwards or advances a very participatory approach, and it also says that this people's plan must conform to the CLUP, or the comprehensive land use plans of the local governments, and it must include non-physical development components such as self-help housing, cooperative livelihood, etc. So there's enough support for this very multidimensional framework or approach to provision of adequate housing as a means of reducing vulnerability to climate change and other types of vulnerability. And of course, there's also the Magna Carta of the Urban Poor, okay, which promotes affordable, safe, and culturally appropriate place. And let me emphasize safe here because of the presentation of Dr. Karaos earlier, where a community was relocated in a clearly unsafe area. And we also find this framework in our PDP, or our Philippine Development Plan. And so how have we in SHAFC, or the Social Housing Finance Corporation, tried to work with this multidimensional framework of this multidimensional way of looking at vulnerability and resilience. In terms of reducing exposure, we make use of science, of data, through Hazard Hunter, to ensure that our sites are safe from hazards, like liquefaction, flooding, storm surge, earthquakes. So we use Hazard Hunter. This is newer than the Project NOAA that was made available before online. We also require MGB
Attorney
report.
Jay, can you wrap up, please?
Yes. Okay. So we all have this intervention, these ways of ensuring that our sites are free of geophysical hazards. But at the same time, we make sure that we improve adaptive capacity through our in-city approach, so that people will continue to have access to livelihood and economic opportunities that abound in the cities. And we also more recently started going into settlements management, so that we can handhold the communities as they try to recover, from the stresses that result from relocation. Okay? And of course, there's livelihood assistance and GAD. We put these two together because many of our community leaders are women, and we believe that we need to assist them more. So because making them more resilient would also redound to the resilience of the entire community. And the last one, moratorium and cash assistance, would answer one of the policy recommendations of Dr. Karaos regarding the need for moratorium and also revision of amortization whenever communities experience disaster. So this is two of the assistance types of assistance that we give our communities. We give them a moratorium and also cash assistance in the amount of 10,000 pesos. No? That's the immediate assistance that we give them. So our point of showing this, showing our community-driven approach, our women-driven approach, is that it can be done, no? And there's enough legal basis for doing so. So these are just some examples of our actual presentations during board meetings, where we really ensure that our sites are safe from hazards. No? Okay. And so what's the result of this? Our communities have been rated level 5, meaning after relocation, they were gaining on a lot of aspects, no? Security, health, incomes, etc., with only minor problems. The lowest level is level number 1. And we don't have any projects rated below level 4. So it's either level 5 and 4. No? And you see that here. No? Both our in-city and off-site projects are rated level 5. And these are just some pictures, okay, of how we tried to move our communities from highly exposed, dangerous areas, no, to safer areas. Okay, now this is why I'm glad that Congressman Benitez mentioned earlier that they will try to increase the budget for housing, because in the last 10 years, the average okay, the average budget that has been allocated for housing is only 0.71% of the total national budget. Okay, it's not even 1%. No? It's not even 1%. It's 0.71 only. No? And if you compare it with the allocation for other departments, it's just a mere line in this pie. No? It's not even a slice of pie, but just a mere line. The light blue line, housing 0.08, no? That's for 2019. Okay. So okay, what have we learned from our experience? Okay. Firstly, that we need science-based systems approaches so that we can avoid what happened to Kasiglahan, as presented by Dr. Karaos. And also, the participatory and community-driven approach has worked very well for our programs, especially the participation of women. And also, we have tried to prioritize in-city resettlements so as not to uproot people from their sources of livelihood and from the social networks that provide them support. And we need also to be holistic, okay, and include post-occupancy settlements management in our housing. And of course, the multi-stakeholder approach is very important, but the role of the LGU is really crucial. The role of the LGU is really crucial, and that's why we have been pursuing an LGU, a greater collaboration with LGUs. And this is our wish list. No? I think there really is a need for sufficient budget, no? Considering that the level of homelessness has reached crisis levels for many years. And of course, we need resources and capacity building for social and economic resilience of communities, especially women. That's why I was excited to reconnect with Mame Ano. We used to work together when I was at with ICSI. And we need better housing design for resilience. So resilience by design, and I was very intrigued by the presentation of Professor Ocampo regarding how they tried to design a community that is women-centered, that will really promote the resilience of women. And finally, we need capacity building for LGUs so that they can adopt a systems approach and a resilience perspective in their city development planning. And I think that's it. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Attorney Junefe. And Ina, can you take over and then get the short responses from our keynote speakers? We're really sorry that we went over time, but the inputs here were very good and very exciting potential for our ways forward. So, Ina.
Okay, so thank you to all our panel of reactors. Thank you, Doc Emma, for moderating. We will be calling back our keynote lecturers, starting from Professor Mary Ann Ocampo, for their final messages in this webinar. So the floor is yours now, Professor.
Great, thank you so much. I want to just applaud the conveners for this discussion. I think the first element that I think is really key is just the fact that we're all together talking about these ideas. And so it brings me so much hope to share this knowledge with each other, practitioners, academics, nonprofit organizations, you know, planners, developers, hopefully. Like, I think that these dialogues are so critical to the way that we think about our future and how to build more inclusive cities and communities. I would say that it's really heartening to hear about bills that are being written advocating for in-city kind of resettlements, advocacy for building 1 million housing units, ways that we hear about the cooperative really being on the ground with communities and thinking about livelihoods, education, health and wellness, security, safety, shelter, and social protection. I thought that was wonderful to see these programs that already exist. And then in the last presentation, the multidimensional framework of understanding, you know, the kind of theoretical ways in which we're seeing this organic, nebulous thing, how it actually functions, how it works, and then to be grounded in the realities of finance, law, policy, and that you can actually achieve and implement this with great design and planning. And then I think what's key to me, it's the idea that one, women are being heard. There are more discussions that happen that really foreground women and girls, those who identify as women, and being part of this kind of planning process. And then that will hopefully being heard, being acknowledged, and then having women participate in the process, lead the process, be part of leadership for, you know, the government, having political leaders in play, women who are in charge of their businesses and being part of more of the decision making. I think that is really key because those different perspectives provide so much insight in the way that we understand our world today. We see it in the United States, we see it in Afghanistan, we see it everywhere. And I think that, you know, for me, there's a special place in my heart for the Philippines, in where my grandmother was a fisherwoman who owned her own business. I think it's a remarkable matriarchal society that has long been well known as being a loving and caring and supportive, I think, community. I think beginning to acknowledge the many roles that women play would mean that that will influence the way we think about future planning and resilience planning, you know, in the long-term future. Thank you.
Professor Mary Ann, Dr. G.
Yes, thank you very much, Mary Ann. I really learned a lot from you on the possibilities, no, for redesigning our housing programs and interventions and redesigning our cities. I am very much appreciative also of the private sector efforts that were shared by Kasagana Ka and We Effect, Jessica and Mean. These are contributions which go down to the very level of the households and individuals and are very much appreciated because government often hardly reaches to this level, no? Reaching out to individuals and families. And your contributions are definitely going a long way in terms of counterparting with government efforts in the area of resilient housing. I'm also very encouraged by the responses from Congressman Benitez and Attorney Junefe, no, of SHFC, because as I had mentioned earlier, there is really a very crucial role for government in improving governance systems and processes so that we can push this agenda of reducing the vulnerabilities of the urban poor, and particularly urban poor women, and increasing their opportunities. And I was encouraged by the legislative initiatives that were mentioned by Congressman Benitez, because I think there's much openness now, at least as far as the legislature is concerned, openness for rethinking and redesigning our housing policies, particularly resettlement policies, so that this can be more science-based, and that the emphasis would also be on in-city, even on-site, no, on-site housing, hopefully in the near future. And Attorney Junefe emphasized the systems approach, which for the longest time has been recognized as a principle, but we really have difficulty executing it in practice, not in our governance processes. But hopefully, with institutions like the SHFC, which has, in a sense, on the government side, pioneered these community-led approaches and has successfully institutionalized it, now there's greater recognition and acceptance among housing agencies for this principle of community-led housing and people's planning. So now this has been accepted as a principle, but implementing it on the ground in terms of concrete programs and given support by budgetary appropriations, that still needs to be pushed further. But it is very encouraging that we have allies in the government who are now championing these concepts and these new ways of thinking about housing and resettlement. So thank you very much, Dr. Porio, for organizing this webinar once again. And thank you for all who participated.
Doc Jing, thank you again to Prof. Mary Ann. We also would like to thank all the participants in the room. Thank you for staying until the end. We apologize for the overtime, no? And we were not able to attend to all the questions, but rest assured these are noted and documented, and the speakers are also seeing your chat messages. To begin officially closing the program, I wish to call our co-convener, no, from the National Resilience Council, Ms. Malu G. Erni, the Executive Director of the National Resilience Council and the former Executive Director of the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation. Ms. Malu, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Ina. Can you hear me?
Yes, Ms. Malu.
All right, so I wish to congratulate SICAR PH led by Dr. Emma Porio for successfully organizing this lecture series as a fitting celebration of Women's Month. Together with our partners, NRC would like to thank you all for attending today's event. And I'm happy to see some of our partners from LGU and Academe from Bataan, Cagayan de Oro, or MOC, and Zamboanga. Our deep appreciation also goes to today's very distinguished speakers and reactors for their excellent presentations and for putting a spotlight on gender, environment, and resilience building. It has been quite a tough year for all of us, but having a virtual stage to continue doing our work on climate and disaster resilience is truly a blessing. The insights and exemplary practices shared by our speakers and panel reactors are important possibilities for consideration as we continue to facilitate the resilience of cities, build sustainable communities, and help improve their quality of life. The need for a systems approach to address vulnerabilities and inequities was an underlying theme among all of our speakers. In our resilience framework, which is also aligned with K-Co-op services as presented earlier by Ms. Mean, gender has been embraced in the human development pillar, particularly on health and social protection. It is also captured in the local economy pillar, specifically under livelihoods or the informal sector. The infrastructure pillar on lifelines and housing includes indicators and measures of performance appropriate to the most vulnerable. Although the reference to women as a vulnerable sector still has to be made more holistic and better informed by taking on a gender perspective. Women and children have distinct vulnerabilities when it comes to disaster, as highlighted in today's discussion. This, by and large, shapes their experience in times of disasters and influences the recovery processes. Accordingly, it is important to engage, involve, and capacitate them in the whole disaster resilience spectrum in order to consider their needs and situation. In the context of our work with local government units, we engage our partners in reducing vulnerabilities of the respective communities to hazards through our climate and disaster risk assessment. Likewise, we have institutionalized a multi-stakeholder platform through the local resilience councils that engages and provides space for the participation and involvement of the gender and development offices of our partner LGUs. NRC's leadership program engages LGUs in deepening systems thinking and in ensuring that their local plans and budgets are not only risk-informed and resilience-driven, but gender-sensitive and socially inclusive as well. Lastly, we have also been working with and supporting our local chief executives who are advocates of gender equality, such as Zamboanga City Mayor Ben Climaco Salazar and Iriga City Mayor Madel Alfelor, who are staunch supporters of women's and children's rights insofar as the resilience journey is concerned. We draw inspiration from Dr. Emma Porio and other leading lights of gender equality and women empowerment, such that we make a conscious effort to integrate gender perspectives into our resilience agenda and help shape our partners' efforts to move from risk to resilience. Well, this has been a learning experience for me, and I hope that you have likewise gained some insights into this very interesting, informative conversation. May we all bounce forward together and rise to the challenges of equity and sustainability. Thank you all very much, and I wish you all a blessed Easter. Gandang umaga sa lahat.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Malu. And for final messages, let us call back Dr. Emma Porio, our co-convener for this webinar.
All right. We went over time. I'm sorry about that. We had several glitches, but I will be short. But for those who will be interested in staying, the are perfectly welcome. So in closing, I would like to thank all our distinguished speakers. The keynote speakers were equally, scintillating in terms of showing to us what are the key issues, what should we be paying attention to, and the like. And also, they were matched by equally highly accomplished panel of reactors. We're very grateful for all your intellectual generosity. As I always say, we can never do these things without the generosity, support, and kindness of all our partners. So thank you, NRC. Thank you, Mianne, Mary Ann, Ding, Congressman Kiko, Benitez, Attorney Junefe, and Jessica Soto. Thank you very much. What I really want to appeal to all of you, to everyone, to be proud of solutions and systems lens. That line in the master of resilience and also as Mary Ann says, we bounce forward together. A la mañana. Mañana is our idol in the Resilience Council, and we follow his steps. So thank you very much, Mian. Thank you, everyone. So I want to thank everyone for staying with us. And also, please note that all the recordings of our webinars are on our YouTube channel, also on our Facebook page. So please keep watch. We're really interested in connecting and linking with you. And so thank you and very much. I think this is really, for me, this is March 31. It's the end of Women's Month. It's just our work is just beginning. And I'm very thankful to all of you because you have made us, very more focused. I think we should be more focused. We should be very deliberate in our proactive responses and our actions, okay? So thank you. We'll see you in our next webinar and we'll continue working together. Thank you. Ina, we will, please announce it.
Thank you. Thank you, Doc Emma. For those who wish to request certificates, we received your emails, but I will also be sharing the link with you. This also includes our evaluation form, and so we can receive your feedback from the webinar. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you for concluding Women's Month with CRPH and NRC. Have a great week ahead.